I never thought I'd become one of those people who obsess over small details. You know, the kind who analyze every little change, every slight difference in daily routines. But life has a way of teaching you that sometimes the smallest shifts can signal the biggest changes. My marriage to Sarah was what most people would call comfortable. 23 years of shared morning coffees, weekend grocery shopping, and evening TV shows. We had our routines down to a science. Sarah would leave for her job at the law firm at 7:30 a.m. sharp, wearing her signature perfume, Chanel No. 5, the same scent she'd worn since our first date. I'd head to my engineering firm 30 minutes later, and we'd reconnect over dinner, sharing stories about our day. It wasn't exciting, but it was ours. Or at least, that's what I thought until last Tuesday. I first noticed something was off when Sarah came home that evening. As she walked past me to hang up her coat, a scent caught my attention. It wasn't her usual perfume. This was different, distinctly masculine, a cologne I didn't recognize. "New perfume?" I asked casually, not looking up from my laptop. "Oh no," she laughed, a bit too quickly. "Just tested some samples at the department store during lunch. You know how they spray those things everywhere." I nodded, but something about her answer didn't sit right. Sarah hated department store perfume sections. She always complained about the overwhelming mix of scents giving her headaches. The next day, everything seemed normal again. Her familiar Chanel scent, her usual routine. But 3 days later, that masculine cologne was back. This time, it was fainter, as if she'd tried to mask it. When I hugged her hello, I could detect her regular perfume layered over something else, that same cologne. Sarah had always been a creature of habit. In 23 years, she'd never changed her perfume, her hair products, or even her brand of toothpaste without extensive research and discussion. Yet, here she was, coming home with a strange men's cologne, offering flimsy explanations about department store samples. I found myself paying attention to other details I'd previously ignored. The increasing frequency of late meetings, the way she'd started angling her phone away when texting, how she'd begun dressing differently on certain days of the week, wearing clothes I'd never seen before. Small changes, tiny shifts in our carefully constructed routine. But sometimes the smallest details speak the loudest, don't they? I didn't want to become that suspicious husband who checks his wife's phone or follows her around. But once you notice something off, it's like your brain won't let you ignore it anymore. Every detail becomes a potential clue, every slight change a red flag. The cologne incident kept nagging at me. I found myself noting each time it appeared, always on Wednesdays and occasional Fridays, never on Mondays or Thursdays. There was a pattern forming, and I couldn't unsee it. "Working late again?" I asked one Wednesday evening when she called. "Big case," Sarah replied. Her voice had that slightly breathless quality I'd begun to recognize. "Don't wait up for dinner." I sat in my home office after that call, staring at my computer screen without really seeing it. 23 years of marriage teaches you things about a person, like how Sarah always gets slightly breathless when she's not telling the whole truth. It's a tell she doesn't even know she has. I decided to do something I'd never done before. I drove to her law firm, just to pick her up, I told myself, just to surprise her with dinner plans. It was 7:30 p.m. when I pulled into the parking lot. The security guard recognized me from firm events. "Looking for Mrs. Miller?" he asked. "She left about an hour ago." My stomach dropped. Left? Yeah, with that new partner from the merger team. They've been working late a lot lately. He said it casually, like he was commenting on the weather. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel. An hour ago, when she'd called to say she was working late, the cologne, the new partner. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture I didn't want to see. As I drove home, I remembered something else. Sarah had started using our joint credit card less, switching to her personal one more often. "Just better rewards," she'd said. Now I wondered what those statements might show. What restaurants? What hotels? What evidence of a life I didn't know about? I wasn't going to check those statements, not yet. But I had a feeling that once I did, I wouldn't be able to go back to pretending everything was normal. I lasted exactly 2 days before I looked up the credit card statements. 2 sleepless nights of lying next to Sarah, listening to her breathe, wondering if she was dreaming about him. It's amazing how a bed that's held you comfortably for decades can suddenly feel like it's made of concrete. The statements told their own story. Regular charges at a high-end restaurant downtown, always on Wednesdays. A hotel bar that appeared with suspicious frequency, and there it was. A receipt from Nordstrom's men's department, the Cologne. She'd bought it herself. I found myself doing things I never thought I would, like memorizing the parking lot schedule at her firm, noting which cars stayed late. There was a silver BMW that seemed to match her new schedule perfectly. Dark windows, spotless finish, the kind of car a successful new partner might drive. One evening, I caught a glimpse of him. Tall, maybe mid-40s, with the kind of confidence that comes from never doubting your place in the world. He held the door for Sarah as they left the building together. The familiarity in their body language hit me like a physical blow. The way she leaned slightly toward him when she laughed. The casual brush of his hand against her back. And there it was, that cologne. Even from my parked car across the street, I could imagine its scent. The same one that had first alerted me to this whole nightmare. The same one she brought home on her clothes, trying to pass it off as department store samples. I watched them walk to his car, the silver BMW, of course. I could have followed them, could have confronted them right there. Instead, I drove home and poured myself a drink, trying to wash away the taste of betrayal. That night, when Sarah came home, she kissed my cheek like always. That cologne lingered on her skin, mixing with her perfume, in a way that made my stomach turn. I wondered if he could smell her perfume on his clothes too. If he went home to someone who asked him about that unfamiliar scent. The next morning, I did something that would change everything. I went to Nordstrom's and bought that cologne. The same brand, the same scent that had been haunting our house for weeks. The saleswoman smiled as she rang it up, probably thinking it was just another ordinary purchase. She had no idea she was selling me the key to unraveling my marriage. I placed the bottle prominently on the bathroom counter, right next to Sarah's cosmetics. Then I waited. The sound of her key in the door that evening seemed unusually loud. I heard her heels on the hardwood floor, the rustle of her coat being hung up. The familiar routine that now felt like a carefully rehearsed performance. She went upstairs to change, like she always did. I counted the seconds until I heard her footsteps falter in the bathroom, the slight intake of breath that told me she'd seen it. David? Her voice was carefully controlled when she came downstairs, but I could hear the edge of panic. Did you buy new cologne? I looked up from my laptop, keeping my face neutral. Yeah, thought I'd try something new. The scent caught my attention recently. I watched her face closely as I said this, the slight widening of her eyes, the almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw. It's nice, she managed, but her hands were clasped tightly together. I stood up and walked toward her, watching as she fought the urge to step back. I'd already applied the cologne, the same scent that she brought home on her clothes, the same one I'd smelled on him. Her nostrils flared slightly, and I saw something flash across her face. Recognition, guilt, fear. Funny thing about scents, I said quietly. How they can trigger such specific memories, don't you think? She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The truth was there in her silence, in the way she couldn't quite meet my eyes, in how her body had tensed at the familiar scent coming from the wrong person. The game was over. We both knew it. The next few days passed in a strange haze. We performed our usual routines like actors in a play, both knowing the script was a lie. Sarah still kissed me goodbye in the mornings, but her lips barely touched my cheek. I still asked about her day, but we both knew I was really asking where she'd been, who she'd been with. I kept the cologne bottle on the bathroom counter. A silent accusation. Sometimes I'd catch her staring at it, her face a mixture of fear and something else. Relief, maybe. The relief of no longer having to maintain the perfect facade. The funny thing about discovering your wife's affair is how it makes you question everything. Every late meeting over the past months, every business dinner, every time she said she was having lunch with her friend Beth. Had they all been lies? I found myself rebuilding our calendar in my head, marking the days she'd come home with that cologne scent, cross-referencing them with her excuses. I didn't confront her directly, not yet. Instead, I started my own performance. I worked late, too, making sure to mention casual dinner meetings with colleagues. I changed my aftershave, bought new clothes, small changes that I knew she'd notice. Let her wonder if I'd found someone, too. Let her feel that twist of uncertainty in her stomach. One evening, I came home to find her in our home office, looking through old photos on her laptop, wedding pictures, family vacations, 23 years of shared memories. She quickly closed the laptop when she saw me, but not before I caught the shine of tears in her eyes. "Looking for something specific?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Just reminiscing," she said softly. Then, after a pause, "We were happy, weren't we?" Were. Past tense. The word hung between us like a death sentence. "Happiness is a funny thing," I replied, leaning against the doorframe. "It's like cologne. The scent can linger long after the bottle's empty." She flinched. Actually flinched. I felt a surge of bitter satisfaction, followed immediately by a wave of self-disgust. What had we become? Two people who'd shared a bed for over 2 decades, now trading veiled barbs and pointed silences. That night, I lay awake listening to her pretend to sleep, the carefully measured breathing of someone trying too hard to appear peaceful. I thought about the silver BMW in the parking lot, the casual touch of his hand on her back, the cologne that had started it all. I reached for my phone and opened the browser, started researching divorce lawyers, not the ones from her firm, I wasn't stupid, but others equally prestigious, equally expensive. I saved their numbers, but didn't call, not yet. First, I needed a plan, because this wasn't going to be a simple divorce, not after 23 years, not after she'd made me question every memory, every moment we'd shared. She'd chosen her path carefully, calculated her moves. Now it was my turn. I got up quietly and went to the bathroom, picked up the cologne bottle, studied it in the dim light, such a small thing to destroy a marriage. But then again, it wasn't the cologne that did it. It was the choices, her choices, and now mine. I spent the next week meticulously building my case. It's surprising how much evidence you can gather when you know what you're looking for. Credit card statements, phone records, email timestamps. Each piece of data told part of the story, forming a timeline of betrayal that stretched back months. The partner's name was Michael Reynolds. It wasn't hard to find information about him once I knew where to look. Recently divorced, joined the firm 8 months ago as part of a merger. His corporate bio painted him as a legal wunderkind, specializing in corporate restructuring. Ironic, considering how he was restructuring my marriage. I hired a private investigator. Not to follow Sarah. I already knew where she went on her late nights. Instead, I had him dig into Reynolds's past, his previous cases, his professional reputation, his personal life. Knowledge is power, after all, and I needed all the power I could get. The PI's report arrived in my secure email on a Wednesday morning. Sarah had left early that day, wearing a new dress I'd never seen before. The cologne scent lingered in the bathroom, stronger than usual. Special occasion, apparently. The report made for interesting reading. Reynolds had a pattern. This wasn't his first office affair, just his most recent. 3 different firms, 3 different married women, Each time he'd moved on when things got messy. Each time he'd landed somewhere better. Failed marriages were just stepping stones in his career path. I found myself watching Sarah more closely, wondering if she knew. Did she think she was special? Different from the others? Or was she just so caught up in the excitement that she didn't care? That evening she came home late, as expected. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright, happy. She hadn't looked at me that way in years. "Good meeting?" I asked casually. "Very productive," she replied, not meeting my eyes. "We're making real progress on the merger case." I nodded, thinking about the hotel receipt from earlier that day. "Mergers can be complicated," I said. "Sometimes people don't do enough due diligence, don't look closely enough at past patterns." She paused in the middle of taking off her earrings just for a moment, then continued as if nothing had happened, but I saw the slight tremor in her hands. Later, I sat in my home office, reviewing the PI's report again, photos of Reynolds with his previous conquests, documentation of his pattern, evidence of how each affair had ended, messily for the women, profitably for him. I opened my laptop and started composing an email. Not to Sarah, not yet. To the managing partner at Reynolds's previous firm, the one he'd left abruptly 2 years ago, the one where his last affair had ended in a quietly settled sexual harassment suit. It was time to start asking some uncomfortable questions, time to make some waves in Reynolds's carefully constructed world. Because the best revenge isn't just about exposing the affair, it's about understanding your enemy's weaknesses and using them against him. Sarah had chosen her battlefield, but she'd forgotten something crucial. In 23 years of marriage, she'd told me every secret, every vulnerability, every fear. She'd given me all the ammunition I needed. Now it was just a matter of choosing my targets carefully. The response from Reynolds's former firm came faster than I expected. A carefully worded email expressing concerns about similar situations and patterns of behavior. Reading between the lines, it was clear. I wasn't the first husband to start asking questions, just the first one to know exactly what to ask. I spent the next few days setting up my pieces carefully. Each email, each phone call, each carefully planted question was like moving a chess piece into position. The managing partner at Sarah's firm received an anonymous tip about Reynolds's history. The firm's HR department got a detailed inquiry about their policies on workplace relationships, small ripples that would soon become waves. Sarah started coming home earlier. The cologne scent grew fainter, less frequent. I noticed her checking her phone more anxiously, her brow furrowing at messages she didn't want me to see. Something was changing in her perfectly orchestrated affair. One evening, I heard her on the phone in our bedroom, voice low but intense. "What do you mean, looking into it? Who's asking questions?" A pause. "No, of course not. He couldn't know that much. But I did know. I knew about the hotel in Chicago where Reynolds had met the associate from his last firm. Knew about the settlement that had been quietly paid. Knew about the pattern of promotions that always seemed to follow his indiscretions. Knowledge is indeed power." I watched Sarah's carefully constructed world start to crumble. Reynolds became distant, cautious. Their late meetings grew shorter, less frequent. She started wearing her old clothes again, her old perfume. The costume of a faithful wife hastily put back on. The cologne bottle still sat on our bathroom counter, untouched, a monument to what we'd become. Sometimes I caught her staring at it, her face a mixture of longing and fear. Not fear of losing Reynolds, fear of what I might do with what I knew. One morning, I noticed she'd been crying. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her makeup slightly smudged. "Tough case?" I asked, maintaining our facade of normalcy. "Just complicated," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Complications have a way of working themselves out," I said, picking up the cologne bottle and studying it. "Sometimes all it takes is the right person asking the right questions. She froze, coffee cup halfway to her lips. In that moment, I saw understanding dawn in her eyes. She knew that I hadn't been sitting idly by, knew that her carefully hidden affair wasn't so hidden anymore. That evening, Reynolds canceled their dinner plans. "Work emergency," Sarah said, trying to sound casual as she hung up the phone, but we both knew what it really was: self-preservation. Reynolds was backing away just like he had with all the others, just like I knew he would. I sat in my home office that night composing one final email. This one would go to Reynolds directly, simple, brief, but devastating in its implications. Just 3 elements: a photo from his Chicago hotel stay, a copy of the previous settlement agreement, and a single question: how much is your career worth? The stage was set. All the pieces were in place. Now it was just a matter of watching it all unfold. Sarah's perfect affair was about to implode, not with a bang, but with a series of careful, precise moves that would leave no doubt about who was really in control. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about exposing the truth to everyone, it's about letting your targets destroy themselves. The response to my email came at 3 a.m. I was awake to see it arrive. Sleep had become a distant memory lately. Reynolds's reply was short: "Let's meet." I smiled in the dark of my home office. Predictable. Men like Reynolds always think they can negotiate their way out of anything. That's what makes them successful and vulnerable. The next morning, Sarah left for work earlier than usual. Her hands shook as she applied her makeup, and she'd changed outfits 3 times. The cologne scent was conspicuously absent. I watched her through the bathroom mirror as she struggled to maintain her composure. She knew something was wrong, but couldn't quite figure out what. I met Reynolds at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory. He looked different up close, less confident, more desperate. The kind of look men get when they realize they're not as untouchable as they thought. "Whatever you think you know," he started, but I cut him off by sliding a folder across the table. "Chicago, the Maxwell Hotel, June 15th last year. Sharon Davidson from Turner and Pierce." I watched his face pale slightly. "Or should we discuss Rebecca Martinez from your San Francisco days? The settlement there was quite generous." He reached for the folder but didn't open it. His hands weren't quite steady. "What do you want?" "Want?" I smiled, taking a sip of my coffee. "I want you to experience what it's like to lose everything you've built, piece by piece, just like you've done to others." "I can make this worth your while," he offered, his voice low. "Name your price." I leaned forward. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't about money, it's about consequences. Check your email at 2 p.m. today. You'll find copies of some interesting documents have been sent to your firm's ethics committee. Nothing explicit, just enough to raise some very uncomfortable questions." The look on his face was worth every sleepless night I'd spent planning this. "You can't." "I already have. But here's the interesting part. I've set up similar emails to be sent every few days, each one revealing a little more. Unless, of course, you make the right decision. Which is, end it, today, and then resign. Find a position at another firm, preferably one far away. Sarah never needs to know about your history, about the others. She can think it just didn't work out." He studied me for a long moment. "You're protecting her," he said finally, "after what she did?" "No," I replied, standing up. "I'm ensuring she feels the full impact of her choices. Sometimes mercy is the cruelest revenge." I left him sitting there, staring at the unopened folder. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking, not from fear or anger, but from the pure electric thrill of knowing my plan was working. The first domino was about to fall. Sarah came home early that evening, looking like she'd aged 5 years in a single day. I could read the signs of stress in every movement, the way she kicked off her heels too roughly, how she poured her wine with a slightly shaking hand, the constant checking of her phone. I pretended to be absorbed in my laptop while watching her fall apart. She'd received the news by now. Reynolds had ended things. Probably gave her some vague excuse about professional boundaries and office politics. I wondered if she'd noticed how nervous he'd seemed, how his eyes had darted around during their conversation. "Rough day?" I asked, not looking up from my screen. She jumped slightly at my voice. "Just office politics. You know how it gets." "Anything interesting?" She took a large swallow of wine. "Michael Reynolds resigned, effective immediately. Something about a better opportunity in Seattle." I finally looked up, watching her face carefully. "That sudden. Wasn't he handling the merger?" "Yes," she said softly, staring into her wineglass. "He was." The next few days were a master class in disintegration. I watched as Sarah tried to maintain her composure while her world crumbled. Reynolds wasn't just leaving. He was systematically erasing every trace of their relationship. Her calls went unanswered. Her emails bounced back. The silver BMW disappeared from the parking lot. But that was just the beginning. The Ethics Committee's investigation was gaining momentum. Whispers began circulating through the firm. Nothing concrete, nothing actionable, just questions. Questions about Reynolds's sudden departure, about his previous positions, about late-night meetings and expense reports. Sarah started having trouble sleeping. I'd hear her pacing in her home office late at night, probably scrolling through old messages, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. The cologne bottle remained untouched on the bathroom counter, a silent reminder of what she was losing. One morning, I overheard her on the phone with her friend Beth, her real friend Beth, not the cover story version. "It doesn't make sense," she was saying, voice tight with confusion. "Everything was fine, and then suddenly, it's like he became a different person overnight. And now these rumors about his past." I smiled to myself. She had no idea that the careful life she'd built was being dismantled by the same attention to detail she'd used to hide it. Every day brought new revelations. Anonymous tips reached other partners. Questions arose about cases she and Reynolds had worked on together. Their late-night strategy sessions suddenly looked different in light of his hasty departure. Her colleagues started treating her differently. Meetings she would have been invited to now happened without her. Cases she would have handled were reassigned. Nothing official, nothing she could fight against, just the slow, inexorable shift of power and trust. I watched it all with a detached fascination. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion, each support beam carefully removed until the whole structure became unstable. The best part? I never had to confront her directly, never had to expose what I knew. I just had to sit back and let the consequences of her choices catch up with her. The cologne bottle sat there through it all, its presence a constant reminder. Sometimes I caught her staring at it, probably remembering how it all started, how one small detail had triggered an avalanche that was now burying her perfect affair, her carefully maintained reputation, and possibly her career. The investigation at Sarah's firm was reaching its crescendo, not with dramatic revelations or public accusations, but with the quiet, deadly efficiency of professional reputation destruction. Each day brought new discoveries about Reynolds' past indiscretions, each one casting a longer shadow over everyone he'd worked with closely. Sarah's name kept coming up in these discussions, not directly, but in the way people stopped talking when she entered rooms, in the subtle shifts of eye contact during meetings, in the gradual redistribution of her cases to other partners. I watched her trying to salvage what she could. She started working longer hours, real work this time, not the fabricated late meetings of before. She'd come home exhausted, her face lined with stress, only to spend hours in her home office trying to protect the career she'd spent decades building. The cologne bottle remained on the counter, but now she avoided looking at it altogether. It had become a symbol of everything she was losing, everything she'd risked. I kept it there deliberately, a constant reminder of how small choices can avalanche into catastrophe. One evening, she received a call that changed everything. I was in my office but could hear her voice, sharp with distress. "What do you mean, historical review? Those cases were perfectly handled." A pause. "No, of course there's nothing to find, but—" Another pause. "You can't be serious. 20 years at this firm, and now—" When she emerged from her office, her face was ashen. "They're reviewing all my cases from the past 6 months, everything I worked on with Michael." I looked up from my book. "Standard procedure, isn't it?" "When someone leaves unexpectedly—" "Not like this," she whispered. "Not with the ethics committee involved." I watched as she poured herself a larger wine than usual, her hand shaking slightly. "You know what the worst part is?" she continued, more to herself than to me. "I can't even contact him to coordinate our responses. He's just gone." "People often show their true nature when facing consequences," I said mildly, turning a page. "Some stay and fight, others run." She shot me a sharp look, the first real sign that she might be suspecting something. I met her gaze calmly, letting her see nothing but casual interest. That night, I heard her crying in the bathroom. Not the dramatic sobs of fresh heartbreak, but the quiet, desperate weeping of someone watching their life unravel thread by thread. I lay in bed, listening, feeling neither victory nor remorse. Just the cold satisfaction of a plan executing perfectly. The next morning, the cologne bottle was gone from the counter. I found it in the trash, but I didn't take it out. Its job was done. The scent that had started this all, that had been my first clue to her betrayal, was no longer needed. The dominoes were falling exactly as planned, and we were approaching the final act. I had one more email scheduled to go out tomorrow. One final revelation that would make any chance of professional recovery impossible. Not just for Reynolds, but for Sarah, too. Sometimes the most devastating revenge isn't exposing the affair itself, but systematically destroying everything they sacrificed their integrity to protect. The final email went out at exactly 9 a.m. I timed it carefully, just when the firm's morning meetings would be starting. Just when Sarah would be trying to salvage what was left of her reputation. I didn't need to be there to witness the impact. I could picture it perfectly, the quiet ping of dozens of emails arriving simultaneously. The gradual spread of whispers as people opened them. The slow turn of heads toward Sarah's office. The email itself was a masterpiece of professional destruction. No explicit accusations, no dramatic revelations, just a carefully curated collection of documents, expense reports, hotel receipts, conference registrations, all perfectly innocent in isolation, all damning when pieced together, and all copied to the ethics committee, senior partners, and HR. Sarah called at 10:30. I let it go to voicemail. She called again at 10:45, then 11. By noon, I had 6 missed calls and a dozen text messages, each more desperate than the last. I spent the morning in my home office reviewing the security camera footage I'd had installed weeks ago. I watched the grainy images of Sarah and Reynolds in the parking lot, their careful attempts at maintaining professional distance betrayed by small gestures, brief touches. I'd never planned to use these videos. They were just insurance. The real damage was already done. At 2 p.m. she came home, hours earlier than usual, her heels clicking frantically on the hardwood floors. I heard her calling my name, her voice tight with panic. "In here," I called from my office, not looking up from my laptop. She burst in, still in her work clothes, her face a mask of fury and fear. "What did you do?" I looked up slowly, taking in her disheveled appearance. The mascara slightly smudged, the hair coming loose from its perfect arrangement. "You'll have to be more specific." "Don't," she snapped. "The emails, the investigation, Michael's sudden departure, all of it. This was you, wasn't it? I leaned back in my chair, studying her. Interesting theory. Almost as interesting as your late-night meetings with Reynolds. Or should I say your hotel rendezvous? The color drained from her face. How long have you known? Long enough? I gestured to my laptop screen, where the security footage was paused. Long enough to do something about it. She stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the screen. You've been watching us? Not just watching, learning, planning. I pulled up another window, the email I'd sent that morning. Did you know about the others, Sarah? The women at his previous firms? Or did you think you were special? Her legs seemed to give out, and she sank into the chair across from my desk. The others? Oh, yes. You weren't his first office romance, just his latest. Although, I smiled thinly, I suspect you might be his last, at least in this city. Sarah stared at the screen, her face growing paler as she scrolled through the evidence. Every receipt, every message, every carefully documented encounter, all laid out in merciless detail. But it was the other names that really caught her attention, the previous affairs, the patterns, the settlements. This can't be real, she whispered. Oh, it's very real. I pulled up another document. This one's particularly interesting. The settlement from San Francisco. Notice the language they used? Pattern of predatory behavior. Abuse of power dynamics. They buried it well, but not well enough. She looked up at me, realization dawning in her eyes. The ethics investigation, the rumors. That was all you? I just asked the right questions, pointed the right people in the right direction. I shrugged. The truth has a way of coming out, doesn't it? Like the scent of cologne that won't quite wash away. You destroyed his career, she said, her voice hollow. No, Sarah. He destroyed his own career, just like he destroyed his marriage and the marriages of those other women. I just accelerated the inevitable. I leaned forward. But here's what's really interesting. When faced with consequences, what did he do? Did he stand by you, fight for you, or did he run, leaving you to face the fallout alone? She flinched as if I'd struck her. You had no right? No right. My laugh was cold, even to my own ears. 23 years of marriage, Sarah. 23 years of trust, of building a life together, and you threw it away for what? Some cheap thrills with a man who's done this before, who's probably already looking for his next conquest? It wasn't like that, she protested, but her voice was weak. Then tell me what it was like, I said, pulling up the security footage again. Tell me about the late meetings, the hotel rooms, the lies. Tell me about how you came home wearing his cologne, thinking I wouldn't notice, thinking I was too blind or too stupid to see what was happening right in front of me. Tears were streaming down her face now. I never thought, that's right, you never thought. About me, about our marriage, about your career, about anything except the excitement of sneaking around. I stood up, walking to the window. But that's the thing about secrets, Sarah. They're like poison. They seep into everything, contaminate everything, and eventually they destroy everything. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice barely audible. I turned back to face her. Want? I don't want anything from you. This isn't about wanting something. This is about consequences, about justice, about watching someone's carefully constructed lies collapse around them. The firm, they'll never trust me again, she said, reality finally sinking in. Probably not. Trust is funny that way. Once it's broken, it's almost impossible to repair. Rather like marriage, isn't it? She stood up suddenly, anger flashing through her tears. You didn't have to do this. You could have just confronted me, asked for a divorce. A divorce? I cut her off. That would have been too easy, too clean. No, I wanted you to experience what I felt. The slow realization that everything you believed in was a lie, the gradual destruction of everything you'd built, the helplessness of watching it all fall apart, piece by piece. I walked back to my desk, pressed a key on my laptop. The screen filled with more emails, more documents. And we're not done yet. There's still more to come. More questions to be asked. More stones to be turned over. Sarah's legs gave out again, and she collapsed back into the chair. "Please," she whispered, "just tell me what you want me to do." I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I want you to sit there and watch. Watch as everything you sacrificed our marriage for crumbles around you, just like I had to watch you destroy what we had, one lie at a time." The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah sat there, broken, as years of professional reputation and personal dignity crumbled around her. I watched her carefully, noting every micro-expression, every subtle shift in her posture. This was what I'd waited for, the moment when she finally understood the full scope of what she'd lost. "The Ethics Committee meets tomorrow," I said finally, breaking the silence. "They'll have some interesting questions for you, about case assignments, about late-night meetings, about expense reports that don't quite add up." "I'll lose everything," she whispered, more to herself than to me. "No," I corrected her softly. "You already lost everything. You just didn't know it yet. The moment you decided our marriage wasn't enough, the second you chose to wear his cologne home, that's when you lost everything. This?" I gestured to the laptop screen. "This is just the curtain finally falling." She looked up at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in months. "How can you be so cold about this?" "Cold?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You want to talk about cold? Let's talk about how coldly you planned your affair, how methodically you constructed your lies, how carefully you maintained your double life." "No, Sarah, I'm not cold. I'm just better at this game than you were." I stood up, walking to the cabinet where I kept our family photos. 23 years of memories, all tainted now. "You know what's ironic? If you'd just asked for a divorce, I would have given you one. Clean, simple, dignified. But you chose this path. You chose the lies, the sneaking around, the betrayal." "I never meant to hurt you," she said weakly. "That's the thing about intent, Sarah. It doesn't matter. The damage is done whether you meant it or not." I turned back to her. "But here's what really interests me. Throughout this whole conversation, you haven't once asked about him, about Reynolds. Aren't you curious what happened to your perfect lover?" Her face paled even further. "What did you do?" "Me? Nothing he hadn't already done to himself. His pattern was there for anyone to see. I just made sure the right people saw it." I sat down again, facing her. "He's probably in Seattle by now, starting fresh. That's his pattern too. Run when things get messy. Leave the wreckage behind." Sarah's hands were shaking as she reached for her phone. I need to call him?" I finished for her. "Go ahead. His number's been disconnected. His email too. Like I said, he runs. You were just another stepping stone in his career path. The difference is, this time, he won't land somewhere better." The reality of her situation finally seemed to hit her fully. The tears started again, but these were different, not tears of shock or fear, but of pure despair. The kind that come when you realize you've destroyed everything you had for something that was never real to begin with. I stood up one final time, gathering my laptop. "I'll be staying at the lake house for a while. You can have some time to process everything." "Oh, and Sarah?" I paused at the door. "Don't bother trying to salvage anything at the firm. Some bells can't be unrung. The lake house had always been our escape, but now it became my sanctuary." In the weeks that followed, I watched from afar as everything played out exactly as planned. Sarah resigned from the firm. "Personal reasons" was the official statement, but the damage was already done. The whispers and rumors would follow her wherever she went next. I spent my days sitting on the dock, watching the water, and reflecting on how revenge changes you. Not the act itself, but the meticulous planning, the careful execution, the cold satisfaction of seeing everything fall into place. It's like playing chess, but with real lives as pieces. And when you win, you realize the victory feels different than you imagined. The divorce papers arrived by courier. Sarah had signed them without contest, giving me everything I asked for, the house, the investments, even her share of the lake house. It was as if she was trying to make amends through material sacrifice, or maybe she just wanted it all to be over. Reynolds had indeed surfaced in Seattle, but not at the prestigious firm he'd hoped for. Word travels fast in legal circles, and some reputations are impossible to shake. Last I heard, he was doing contract work, a far cry from his partner status. Sometimes the most effective revenge is just letting someone's true nature become public knowledge. I kept the cologne bottle, not on display anymore, but tucked away in a drawer. A reminder of how small details can unravel an entire life. Sometimes, late at night, I would take it out and wonder, had she ever really loved me? Or had our 23 years together been just another carefully maintained facade? The lake house began to feel different too, cleaner somehow, as if the truth, however painful, had cleared the air. The silence that had once felt accusatory now felt peaceful. I was learning that revenge, properly executed, doesn't just destroy. It also clears the ground for something new to grow. Beth called me one afternoon, about a month after everything ended. Sarah's friend Beth, who had unknowingly been part of so many cover stories. She wasn't calling to take sides or place blame. She just wanted to understand. "You could have exposed the affair directly," she said, "made it public, humiliated them both. Why go through such an elaborate plan?" I watched a boat cut across the lake as I considered her question. "Because public humiliation fades," I finally answered. "People forget scandals. But losing everything you've worked for, piece by piece, watching it crumble, while knowing exactly why but being powerless to stop it, that stays with you." "And has it helped?" she asked softly. "Has it made you feel better?" I thought about the nights I'd spent planning, the meticulous attention to detail, the cold satisfaction of watching my strategy unfold. It wasn't about feeling better. It was about justice, about consequences. But later that night, her question haunted me. Had it helped? The anger that had driven me was gone, replaced by something else. Not peace exactly, but clarity. I understood now that revenge hadn't just changed Sarah's life. It had changed me too. I found myself paying attention to details differently now, not looking for betrayal anymore, but seeing the world with new eyes. The way morning light hit the water, the subtle shifts in the wind, the small moments that make up a life. Sarah had chosen her path, pursuing excitement and novelty. I had chosen mine, executing a plan of precise destruction. We had both been transformed by our choices. The difference was, I had done it with my eyes open, fully aware of every step, every consequence. In the end, maybe that was the real victory. Not the destruction of her career or his reputation, but the absolute clarity of purpose I had found in the process. Some people's lives fall apart in chaos. I had learned to dismantle them with precision. 6 months after everything ended, I finally cleaned out the drawer where I'd kept the cologne bottle. Not to erase the memory. I would never forget that scent, or what it had revealed. But because I no longer needed physical reminders. The lesson had been permanently absorbed into who I'd become. I heard through mutual friends that Sarah had moved to Chicago, starting over in a new city at a smaller firm, rebuilding from scratch. Part of me wondered if she ever thought about how it all unraveled, if she understood that it wasn't the affair itself that had destroyed everything, but the careful lies, the small deceptions, the trust broken in 1,000 tiny ways. The lake house became my permanent home. The city held too many echoes of our past life, too many ghosts of what we'd been. Here, watching the seasons change across the water, I found a different kind of peace, not the comfortable stability I'd known in my marriage, but something more solid, born from facing betrayal and choosing my response with deliberate precision. Sometimes I think about how it all started, with a scent, a small detail that most people would have missed or ignored. Life's biggest changes often pivot on these tiny moments of awareness. The difference is in what you choose to do with that knowledge. I never regretted my choice, not the cold calculation of my revenge, not the methodical dismantling of their lives. Because in executing my plan, I discovered something about myself. I was capable of far more than I'd ever imagined. Not just in terms of planning and strategy, but in my capacity to reshape reality itself. The water is particularly calm this evening as I write this, reflecting the sunset like a mirror, perfect for contemplating life's strange turns. How betrayal can lead to transformation, how revenge, properly executed, can become a form of art, and how sometimes the most powerful response to having your world destroyed is learning to rebuild it entirely on your own terms.